illuminating white text appears that says, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." Now, curvy golden yellow text stationary in the middle of the screen with stars flying by through hyperspace that reads, "Theory of a Blind Man." Golden yellow text begins to crawl from the bottom of the screen upwards. Episode 3, Return of the Gamer. After the live stream struck back, many clips remain from the destruction of the streams. Hashtag A11Y Gaming highlights and reviews all reside within this channel. Darth Twizzler continues his reign over the galaxy with more content in accessible gaming for all total blind gamers. Soon, all games will be accessible to a totally blind gamer. But until that time has come, Darth Twizzler fights to be noticed as a gamer in the hopes that developers will consider accessibility. The text continues to crawl away from view deep into the infinity of space. As the galaxy settles into a new norm here on YouTube, one thing can be certain. The dark side of the Force is more powerful than you can ever imagine. May the dark side of the Force be with you. As the last of the text disappears, we are left with stars flying by view in hyperspace, then fade to black.
Welcome everybody, good afternoon. I was just realizing just how corny my intro is for the gaming channel. But I love it because it's Star Wars, even though it is, 16-bit, 8-bit Atari sound. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming in today, and I'm going to get to the chat during the question segment if we have one later towards the end. I got some questions for Celia here, which we will get to. So, Celia, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I love your intro. So, you're a Star Wars fan for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Before we really get started, can you give my viewers a little bit of bio background, accolades, that sort of thing in your history and how you got into gaming?
I'll try to keep it short. So, my name is Celia Hodent. I have a PhD in psychology. That's my background. I'm French, so I did my studies in France. And after I got my PhD in psychology, I was specialized in child development and cognitive psychology. I worked a little bit on educational games, and then I moved on to the game industry. So I started to work at Ubisoft in France at HQ. That was 12 years ago. And then I moved on to work at Ubisoft Montreal, where I was working with a playtest lab there, and I was working also on the Rainbow Six franchise. Then I moved on to LucasArts, where I worked on some Star Wars games, or sadly that they never saw the light of day because that was right at the moment where Disney bought Lucas and they closed down LucasArts. So I was working on Star Wars 1313 and other games, and yep. Could not ship that, and this is when I moved on to Epic Games in 2013, where I became the director of user experience there. So we can explain what UX is all about. Perfect. And I worked at the studio level, so I worked on many different projects, including Unreal Engine 4, which is the engine that we used to make games, and I worked on a few games projects, including Fortnite. We're very closely with the Fortnite team up until October 2017, where I left Epic, and I became a independent consultant. So I've been spreading the UX love, explaining what it is, what is the UX mindset, and I've been doing a lot of public speaking since then, and going to studios and explaining all that. I published a book called The Gamer's Brain that explains what UX and what UX is about and how we use cognitive science to make better games. And I'm publishing a new book called The Psychology of Video Games, which is more for a broad audience, to explain a little bit what's the psychology behind making games, but also what's the psychology of playing games and what can be the impacts playing certain games, the potential positive impacts, but also negative impacts. So I've been doing all that. I'm also the curator and creator of the Game UX Summit, which is also a conference where we invite a lot of speakers to talk about UX and on many different aspects, so game design, but also art, production, etc. And I also run the UX Summit at GDC, and just kicked off with a few industry colleagues and friends an initiative around ethical games. So the idea is to try to work together to try to put together a code of ethics, working with researchers and academics, so we can try to put that together and see what, how it would look like to raise the ethics in the video game industry. So sorry, it was a bit long, but I'm trying to cover everything.
That actually kind of goes nicely into the first topic we'll talk about, which is UX, user experience.
Yeah.
So what is that?
Yeah, good question. So UX is about shifting from the perspective of the creator of a product, a service, or system, or a video game for matters, and to adopt the perspective of the user, the human who's going to play the game. So when we create something, we make a lot of assumptions, and it's always difficult to anticipate how a user that does not have all the understanding and knowledge about what you're creating to have the exact same perspective as you do. And so the idea is to shift from that perspective so we can offer the experience that we want to offer to our players. And so for games, it's not only making sure that people can understand what are the goals of the game, they can learn about the controls and learn about all the things that they can do in the game in a good way, and it's not overwhelming, but also since the game is all about engaging people and having fun, we also ensure that people are engaged with the game and they're motivated to play the game and they're not bored. So it's trying to understand all these aspects, and because the experience of a player happens in their mind, the idea is to use some knowledge from cognitive science to anticipate how people are going to perceive, pay attention to the game, memorize elements of the game, so that we can offer the best experience possible. And it's also about placing the human who's going to play the game before the business considerations. This certainly includes considerations around accessibility, inclusion, and ethics.
Okay, nice.
Yep. We try anyway.
Right, yeah, right.
That's the goal. That's the intent.
Give me just a second here. I need to listen. Yep, that's what I thought. Okay, for some reason we have a mad crazy echo on your end.
Uh-oh.
And I don't know why.
Yeah, because I have a mic plugged, so should not be any echo.
I mean, it's not too bad. It's understandable. I just hope people don't get irritated with it. So I apologize, guys. I'm not quite sure why there's an echo, but
I try to speak less loud, so maybe.
No, I don't think that's it. Well, anyway, so the UX, it's getting more into being able to directly impact a player or maybe a targeted audience, that sort of thing, correct?
It's
kind of like marketing.
Say again, sorry?
The UX idea, that's to better not adapt, but
yes, it's to better consider the humans who are going to play the game. Okay. So let's say that you want to make a game about collaboration, and you iterate on your game, and what we do in UX, we adopt what we call a design thinking. So we don't design and implement things just in the silo. We're going to start by doing prototypes, and we test the prototype with the potential target of this game, so players that like that sort of games. And we watch them play, even if it's like a very early version, and sometimes it's very bare bones. But we see is the game understandable, but also is it doing what we hope it does? Like, for example, if we see players not collaborating and killing each other, then we have a problem because this is not the experience that we intended. So it's always placing the human at the center of what we do, and we do that by iterative loops, and we don't spend too much time doing the game on our own in our silo. We do that by loops, and every step of the way we stop and we have players play it, so we can verify that we're in the right direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can we use, now you said you had worked on Fortnite, correct?
Yeah.
So let's use that as an example, because that was a huge success.
Uh-huh.
And so...
Not too bad.
Yeah, right. How did the UX play into that, and how did it... Would you think the UX concept and platform was responsible for Fortnite being as big as it was, besides...
So responsible for Fortnite being as big as it became, I would say no. But to make it as good as a game that it could become, yes, I would say this had a huge impact. Because the idea is so Fortnite is a game about several pillars. So you have the pillar of construction, the pillar of combat, and the pillar of harvesting. And so the idea is that we're going to ensure that these pillars are understandable and they feel good to play. And so we're going to test a bunch of stuff. So all what we call the signs and feedback in the game. So the signs and feedback are all the elements in the game that gives you an indication of what you can do. So it can be audio cues or visual cues to help you understand what you can do. And also, once the player has put their input in the game, so you press a button, you also get a feedback, so visual and audio feedback on what's going on. And these cues are actually very important also for accessibility. This is something that we often say, that you should not have only one channel to give your signs and feedback, because sometimes people only think about visual cues and don't necessarily think about the audio cues. So it's about doing all of that and iterating, but also about what players care about in the game. What are they going to be excited about in the game? What are they want to do, and how can we make sure that they can do that? So, for example, if Fortnite is a game about construction, yes, we ensure that people can understand how to construct, how to build in the game, but also what to do with building. Make building interesting. So, of course, game designers, it's their job to make up the rules of the game, and level designers and system designers, all these people make all the little bricks in the game that's gonna make it a cool game. UX people are here to ensure that all these bricks are going to make sense and for the players. And so we always, again, shift back to the player's perspective, and we iterate. So, for example, in Fortnite, you would have cues of what's going on in the game. Like if you have a chest, if you're close to a chest in the Fortnite game, you would hear an audio cue that you have, like a sound effect associated to the chest. It's a kind of I can't do it, but it's like a chime sound effect. And you also have a glow, so that you can see that there's a chest, because you would see like a visual glow around the chest. So if for example, for players with impaired hearing, you can still see the chest from a below floor. So it's all these elements so that you can understand what's going on in the game, and you can get excited. It's difficult to explain it all because it covers so many things, but it's as simple as making sure that the icons and all the sound effects are going to be understandable, are getting players so that they can learn about the game by experimenting the game, so that we don't want players to be stuck and try and have to look up online to figure out what the hell is that game about, but also how to make sure that players are engaged and having fun, so that they are excited to play and want to come back. Because they're enjoying themselves, and so they feel that they're getting more competent in playing the game, that they can have cool stuff so that they can feel they can express themselves, such as dances in Fortnite or building the fort that you want, but also how to meaningfully play with other players and relate to others. So the multiplayer aspect and collaboratively and cooperate in co-op and competitively. All these aspects are things that we take into account to improve the game. So it's all of that. And when we find that there's a problem, let's say that players don't understand something or never use an ability, we try to figure out why. Also, if players are not excited by something in the game and they don't really come back and they're like, yeah, it was cool, but I'm not really interested. We try to see where it's coming from and if we can fix it so the game can be more usable, but also more fun to play, more engaging.
Yeah, it's really hard to keep a game consistently relevant. So many new games come out. The technology is forever changing. Yeah. So every single game experience is that different. So how is the follow-up with something like UX in a past game?
Yeah, so that's super tough. And if you have games that are online games and they're forever there, this is where it's getting really, really difficult because you need to create new content for players because otherwise they're bored and they move on to the next game. And the problem with video games is like super competitive. And it can be really difficult for studios to stay afloat because it's very costly to develop a game. And now, there's a lot of free-to-play games that have AAA quality and they offer a lot of cool stuff. And now players, a lot of players expect to be able to play all the games for free, and it's making it very difficult for a lot of studios to be able to stay afloat and to offer the level of quality that players expect and keep making money to keep the magic going. So for online games, live online games, it can be really difficult to stay afloat. For box games that we paid back in the day, it was a little bit easier, but even then, it was not a guarantee for success. But it was a little bit easier because there was some closure and people could rest, and there were less games out there, and it was less difficult to ensure that players could stay interested on the very long run.
Right.
So today there's different challenges in terms of UX because we want to ensure that players are going to have fun and want to come back, and we want to make sure that the game is going to be sustainable economically, but we also have to think about ethical considerations even more so than before, because we want to be considerate about the money and the time spent in the game, because players, they could choose so many other games. So if they choose to play our game, we have to be considerate to the time that they offer us. So it's all these questions. That's actually pretty difficult.
Yeah.
Today, it's much more difficult, but that also means that we need to really consider UX and have a UX mindset even more so than before because of all of that.
Yeah, and you're mentioning a little while ago about how older games was a lot easier to deal with because back then I think the mentality was, okay, you have a physical cartridge. When you beat that game, that's done. You're done. That's, woo, I beat the game. Yay.
Yep.
I mean,
sometimes you had DLCs.
What's that?
So sometimes you had the DLC, so downloadable content.
Well, this is what I'm talking about. Is like 90s. Like before, like PS1 or the original PlayStation, Sega Genesis, Nintendo, those sorts of things. But then, yeah, like you're saying, the downloadable content that comes after that, like Xbox and PlayStation 3 or whatever, then all of a sudden everything changed. In an instant, it seemed like. It was just like, whoa, I don't need a physical thing. Oh, look, there's a download patch. Awesome. So now all of a sudden the whole environment has changed for gaming as far as like what content is provided. Like you're saying, people want free stuff.
Yeah. So
how do you sustain a particular game? We'll just use Fortnite as an example because at least the last time that I checked, it's on its decline because there's so many newer online games that are coming out. So it's mind blowing to think about everything that goes into making a game that's
Yeah.
not only successful but sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the reason why any game that requires some content. So if you have a game that's online, but you need to add new content and new maps, it's even more difficult to sustain. That's the reason why the long-term games today are more games that are either systemic, procedurally generated games like Minecraft, or multiplayer games where the interest is every time you play a new game, because it's different people, or you're just with your friends and you're just enjoying that time with your friend, and it makes it a bit different every time. But even then, you need to have new content. You need to have new weapons or new maps or new characters, and so it can be very difficult for the studio to keep doing that, because the workers there, there's no closure anymore, and when the game goes live, it's not where it ends, it's actually where it starts. And it can be very difficult, and we know that in the game industry there's a lot of crunch time. It's like the nickname that we use for overtime, and it can be quite a toll for workers to keep going and try to make it still exciting and create new assets all the time. So it's quite difficult, and that's the reason why a lot of studios sadly close their doors, and some people are laid off and have to start over. It's quite frequent, sadly, in the game industry.
And it seems to be even more devastating with the world health crisis that's currently going on. And I think speaking about Last of Us Part 2, that was a crucial moment for that game to come out, I believe, because not only was it a continuation, 2015 was the last one, I believe, something like that. But
oh gosh, yeah, probably.
It was a long time ago. But now this one is completely revamped, redone. It's now more inclusive, meaning accessibility. So I think that, sure, you still have to pay for it, but now there's more worth to it, more value to it. Where you've got games like, let's say, Fortnite, or are you familiar with PUBG? Okay, so PUBG's, when Escape from Tarkov, for example, came out, PUBG went down the drain, right? And now Escape from Tarkov, as swiftly as that came out, is kind of facing the same thing, because now not only is it they haven't released any new maps, but for example, hacking, they keep doing the erase, the wipes, because so many hackers are getting in. So that's another aspect that developers have to deal with when coming up with an online game too. To be honest, like, we had a lot of problems back in the day with PC games, because these games were hacked. So much, and hacked. They were what's the term? I forgot in English, but it was hard, and I think it was like 95% of people playing the game were actually had downloaded the game illegally. Oh wow!
And so that created a lot of problems, and some people back in the day, I think it was like in late 2000, like, people were saying, it's the death of PC games, because we're never going to be able to solve for that problem. And at the end of the day, it was not the end of PC games, because a new business model rose, and now it was the game as a service. So it solved the problem of people not paying for the game. But now it's creating another problem, that you need to have always new content, and so it's it is what it is, and it's difficult, and on top of that, the game needs to be good. So it's all of that needs to be considered.
What kind of studies go into researching players when developing UX?
Yeah, so we don't research players, we research the product. I know that we use the term user research, which is a very bad term, but we research the product. And because the product is made for some players, we ask those players to play the game. And so what we do is we observe how they play it, so we can identify if there are problems or stuff that they didn't see, or they didn't hear, or they didn't understand, so that we can fix it. Or we can ask them. We're trying to ask very objective questions. So we're not going to say something like, how do you feel? Do you feel the controls were comfortable, or did you like the interface? We're going to ask stuff like, what was the objective here? What is this icon for? What did you think you had to do here? So we can understand what they really understood, or if there were things that were not super clear, so that we can iterate on the game. So the players is they're just here because they're, we can't, it's really hard because we know all of that. We are the ones who are creating all the assets. It's hard for us to assess if they're understandable or not. So we need new people who don't know anything about the game, but who are familiar with the sort of game that we're making, to help us discover, the things that we don't really realize.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so user research isn't really a
there's a lot of terms that we use that it's actually not really good to express what it is. Same for UX design. There's a lot of people. It's a huge category of professionals are UX designers, and it gives the impression that these people are designing the experience, where an experience cannot be designed because, per definition, an experience is what happens in people's minds as they interact with the system.
Right.
So we design an environment, and we hope that the people, when they're going to interact with the environment, whether it is a game or a tool, they're going to have the experience that we hope for them. And UX designers are not the sole responsible people for the experience. It's the whole team that is responsible for that, because every person is participating in it. The engineers, the artists, the designers. The UX designer are the people who are mostly, I'm simplifying, but they're mostly designing the information architecture. Where do you put what information, and in the interactions, what sort of interactions the player are gonna have to do to, say, craft in a video game.
Okay, cool.
So this is what they do. They don't design the experience, because the experience is what you and me and players are gonna have in their mind as they play.
Okay. We're about to get into the more psychological part of it.
Okay.
Before we do, can you do a quick recap on how your psychology background comes into play with video games?
Sure. So like I was saying, the experience happens in people's minds. And when we design an object or a system, we need to account for the human limitations that we have. So let's take an example with an object, because that also happens with physical objects. If you have a bottle of water, typically the center of the bottle is usually narrower, so it's easier to grip on it so that you can open it more easily. So that's what we call physical ergonomics. It's to make the object more usable and easy to interact with. So it's the same concept. So we need to understand how the human body works, and what's the grip of people's hands, and what's the typical strength that people have, so we can make things more easy to open, for example. But for games, we don't have a lot of physical interactions. We have some. So we think about, for example, the controls. Are we going to ask people to press too many buttons at the same time? And because, maybe it's going to be very hard to do that move in the game. But most of the thing that we think about is the cognitive limitations that we have. And so most of it is around perception, attention, and memory. So for example, perception is subjective. We have a world, it's the reality of our world, and we all have different perceptions of it. And so it's really important to keep that in mind, because what I perceive as someone who's playing some sort of games and have that sort of experience and that sort of culture is not what other people are going to perceive. And so we need to ensure that all the elements conveyed in the game are going to be perceived in the way intended. And also we think about accessibility. So if you're blind, or if you have a hearing impairment, or if you're colorblind, we need to ensure that you're still going to have the information that you need to understand the game. So that's perception. Then we look into the the limitations of memory. So we know that we don't have a very good memory. We don't record things very perfectly, and then when we have to recall them, it's not it's the exact thing that you perceived back in the day. It's not how memory works. Memory is pretty faulty. Memory is a reconstruction of the mind. So perception is a construct of the mind, and when we recall a memory, it's a reconstruction. So there's going to be errors in there because we're not perfect. The brain is pretty flawed. So we don't want players to have to rely on their memory to solve a problem when the game is not about memory skill. So it's interesting. So I don't know if I can. I can give an example from The Last of Us because I'm currently playing it. So no spoilers. But no spoilers, not in the story. But there's a lot of chests in the game, and you have to enter, a digital code to open chests. And most of the time, you'll find the code on a letter, on a piece of paper around. So you have two ways to do that. You can either, when you read the piece of paper, you can memorize the numbers that are in there. But the piece of paper is in your backpack. So if you don't remember it, you can pull out your backpack and get the piece of paper again. So you will rely a little bit on your memory, but if you really don't remember it, there's an option to find the piece of paper. And if you listen carefully, you can actually, just by listening to when you turn the not the knob, how do you call that? To do the combination. When you turn the knobs, it's a knob. You have a different click when you arrive on the number that you need to enter, and so you can also rely on that. You can actually rely on your hearing to open the chest. So it's all these things that we need to think of, so we don't rely too heavily on the memory of players unless we have a good reason to do that. So you can say that relying on and memorizing the code, the combination of the chest, is a design requirement, and this is something that we want players to challenge them on. But most of the time, this is all about determining what are the challenges of the game. So we remove the frustrations and we remove the obstacles to enjoying the game. So the last one is attention. We don't have a very good attention where we're not scanning all what's going on in our environment. And so we know that we're going to miss information around us depending on what we do. When we are focused on the task, it's going to be really hard for us to perceive something else around the specific task that we're focused on. So you might, like, for example, if you're running to catch your train, you might hear, announcements and the train station that's talking about your train, and it's departing from whatever area, and so you're like, focusing on that, and you're running to catch your train. You're not gonna hear pay attention to the other announcements that are not related to your train. You don't care. And so same thing with visual information. When we're focused on one thing, we're not paying attention to the rest. So a lot of games are actually challenging attention. So it's fine to challenge attention, but we just want to make sure we don't overwhelm players with too many elements to pay attention to, especially during the onboarding part of the game. So it's the part of the game when you discover the game and you have to learn a bunch of stuff, because it's actually requiring even more attentional resources than once you have a knack at it and you understand better how the game works, because things become more automatic. So it's all these things that we try to balance and to identify so that we can remove all the frictions from the game that are not part of the challenge that we want for this game. But of course, there are challenges that we want for a game. A game typically has challenges, and for these challenges, we try to make sure that we balance correctly the level of challenge that we want, depending on where the player is in the game.
Interesting. That is fascinating.
It is, right?
Really fascinating. Yeah. Do you think that these games, especially when they're getting more and more advanced and they're getting more realistic or whatever, obviously you remember back in the day, like we were talking before the show, how people said, it's the video game's fault for X, Y, and Z. for someone's real life actions and whatnot. Do you think that, first of all, do you think that's actually a legitimate claim?
No, it's actually, there's a lot of research, especially around violence. And for many decades, we had research on the impact of video games, more specifically on the negative impacts of video games, and more specifically on regarding violent video games. And these research cannot find any evidence that playing violent video games are going to make people violent in their real life. So it's not because you're playing violent games that you're going to act violently in real life. So that we're pretty sure of it now, especially given all the research that has been done on the topic, that it's actually not the case. So we cannot blame video games for all the horrors that are happening in our world.
And it's amazing. Even to this day, you still hear people will say, they'll still preach that ever since it got pushed back in the day. It's like the video game's fault, or it's the music's fault, or TV's
rock
too
and roll,
violent, or
the
rock
radio,
and roll.
comic books, you name it. Every time there's a new technology or a new trend and it's very popular. I mean, because it's new, people are a bit afraid, and that I mean, I can understand that. But we do research, and it's important to be evidence-based when you identify and you look at a new technology or a new culture artifact. For games, video games, it's still we've had video games for 40 years now, like more commercially speaking, and it still has a bad name. So I'm not sure when this is going to stop, and we're going to see video games as another art form, just like movies. And we're going to talk about video games plural, because we have a tendency to say, oh, video games are bad, but hey, there's so many different types of video games, and there's actually a researcher named Daphne Bavelier. She's really interesting. She's researching the positive impact of video games on, for example, spatial cognition, like how you that you can actually, it's video games. Some video games are helping for visual attention, to be able to follow different targets at the same time, and so there's a lot around visual around video games. Sadly, not enough around audio attention, because typically research is always more focused on vision than audio. Sadly, that's another bias that a lot of people have, as I'm sure you're aware. And where I was going with that? Yeah, and she says we can't really talk about the impact of video games, because it's just like the impact of food. There's so many different types of games, just like they have types of food. And so we cannot say that food is good or bad for you. It depends on what food you're eating, why, what's your motivation,
and what does it do to you?
What does it do to you? What's your story? And do you binge eat, or do you binge play video games? It's a very whole different story than playing regularly and have fun with friends and have otherwise a balanced life. So we're not out of that stigma around video games yet. Hopefully we can have a more a deeper conversation about games, because it is true that there are some things that we need to talk about, like ethics that I mentioned earlier. And we can't really talk about that because there's too much of a moral panic around video games. And so we still need to debunk the moral panic. And that I found that sad, because now it's taking more time to actually talk about the more precise things that we need to talk about around inclusion, accessibility, ethics, and all of that.
Yeah, and going back to spatial cognition, I think this is one of the things, too, that kind of lends more evidence to the fact that video games are not to blame, because we have this ability as humans to initially, with our intuition, determine what is real and not. For example, I brought up the whole movie theater / TV scenario.
Yeah.
You know, when you, or better yet, a sports game. If you're at a football or baseball or soccer game, at the arena, it's a different feel than when you're watching it from TV. And our brains know that, whether it is audio or visual. I think, like me personally, I can tell. So That
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah, no, definitely. But I mean, there's still some question about what's the impact of all of media on how we think about certain things. So there's not a lot of research about how the media around us is influencing our how we react to certain people and takes part into discrimination. So, for example, if you see Muslims portrayed always in a certain way, and being people that are aggressive and
well, it's all sensibilization.
it's so yes, it's of course our culture reflects our civilization, but it's hard to know how much they can feed on that. And it's really interesting to try to think about it, especially around underrepresented and marginalized populations that we don't have a lot of media around. Like I've watched on Netflix very recently a documentary called is it disclosed? I don't remember the name of the documentary, but it's talking about trans people and how trans people are portrayed in the media. And because a lot of people don't know a trans person directly, for a lot of times, the only mental model that they have for trans person is through culture, is through movies, is through multimedia, and so maybe for marginalized people, it has an impact is even more powerful than for women. A lot of people interact with women. We represent half of the population. So even if there's a lot of problems around sexism, you have discussions with women and you can see them. So it's harder for marginalized populations when you don't have a direct contact with marginalized people. And I found that very interesting to think about the impact of the media on how we represent and the mental model representation that we have of certain populations. So I do think we need to have this debate, but it's one thing to think about how this is influencing us, and another thing about saying that violent games are going to make us violent in real life. And that was researched quite a bit, and we know that this is not the case.
Now, on the other aspect of that, let's talk a little bit about disassociation. And I've got I believe I put that in the notes for you. Talking about my brother who was in the Air Force, and he would observe certain people that are operating the strike drones, and they got to see it basically from the perspective as it was a video game. Like there was no humanity behind that versus, actually being in a Black Hawk or an Apache going in and doing the great stuff that we've all seen on WikiLeaks. Anyway, so what do you... Where was I going with that? The whole, I guess... disassociation. So yeah, do you think there is a clear distinction subconsciously in our brain holes to tell us like, hey, this is real, that's not?
I think what's interesting in the military is that there is that it seems that there's an intent to remove the military from what's actually happening. So if it's a whole different story to have someone to hold a gun and to aim at someone that you can see breathing and to shoot the gun and to see that person dying right in front of you. Like you have a direct understanding, and it must be really difficult to do such a thing. So ever since we had better technology, the whole idea was to remove ourselves from the consequence of killing someone. So we had like weapons firing from our distance, and then bombs, and then now we understand that we kill people, but we don't see it directly, and so we remove ourselves from the impact. And of course, I'm not saying that the military don't feel the impact of what they're doing, and I know that for many of them it's actually very difficult to handle. But there is that intent to remove ourselves from the consequence of what we do. And And in the same way, we remove ourselves from the consequence of spending money. It's the same concept. So today, like back in the day when we were spending money, it was like coins
Yeah,
and
physical
real.
currency versus credit.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
versus credit and versus digital currency in a video game that you don't buy directly with money. You spend a digital hard currency into soft currency, and then you have the hard currency, and then you have the currency that you buy with the money. So it's again, it's putting some distance, which make it a bit harder to have a precise understanding. We do have the understanding. I'm not saying that we don't understand it, but it's making it a bit farther away. So it could be easier that make it easier for us to spend money, and it could be easier to deal with the trauma of participating in a war when you don't see the people directly dying in front of you. So. I don't know exactly where you're going in there, but it's not really that video games are copying what's going in war. It's more that the warfare, the military, is putting some distance and making wars look more like a video game. So it makes it maybe a little bit more remote in terms of feeling when you actually pull the trigger.
Yeah. I was going along the lines of the disassociating the reality from the video game or military video game warfare, whatever you want to call it, in that since it kind of is, I think, I'm not the psychologist here, but I think that it's hardwired into our brains to be able to determine reality from non-reality. For example, a dream state or an awake state. So when you've got now the military that's say using these simulators and whatnot from the idea of video games, like you said, it's easier for a human being to partake in something like that rather than being on the front line with a physical gun, seeing a physical body fall in front of you.
Yeah, so the whole word wired, like the brain is not wired in the first place. The brain is what we call plastic, so we have brain plasticity, and this is actually a very important a skill that we have so we can adjust to an ever-changing environment. So we try to survive. So there's a lot of things in our brain that is helping us survive. So when we see a threat, and sometimes we're gonna experience a threat that is actually not real or not a very strong threat, but we might identify it as a real threat. Like for example, if you're in Australia and you're in some close to muddy water and you see something moving in the water, you might think, oh shit, this is a crocodile, and you might maybe run away. But if you look more closely, it was actually just a log floating on the river. And better safe than sorry. And sometimes, if you're half awake or it might be difficult to identify what's real and not real. And we have a tendency to see patterns even when they're not there. And that's a way for us to survive. So, yeah, it's a difficult question. And we understand, people understand what's real and not real. But when you train into having a specific drill, like we are afraid of fire, like we know that fire can harm us, but firefighters they go into drills to go beyond their fear, and so it's through the repetition, and we're going to rehearse and do it again and do it again. When it's actual fire, you just go into automatic mode, and so you can go fight the fire. So it's the same principle. And it's a good thing that we're able to go beyond our fear to be able to save people in a fire. But it's the same principle around warfare in the military. We know that hurting someone else, we have empathy. We know that we don't want that, but we understand that we're part of a war, and we accept to be a part of this contract where we have warfare against an enemy. So it's a very complicated concept, and there's a lot of things to say, and I'm not a specialist around that, but that's the idea of through repetition and going into a specific training, it's easier for us to go beyond our fears, so that we can accomplish what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay, nice. Well, we're going to talk about your books here in just a second. For the people in the live chat, get your questions ready. If you have a specific question for Celia here, go ahead and tag her at Celia, and I'll get to those when we're done talking about the books. So, your books, you've written 2, right?
Yes.
Okay. Which one's the first one?
So it's The Gamer's Brain. That's the book that came out 3 years ago now. And this one is more targeted for video game developers, so creators. So I explain, well, the first part of the book explains how the brain works. So I talk about cognitive science, I talk about perception, attention, memory, motivation, emotion, learning principles, and also at the beginning of the book I debunk some neuro bullshit, because there's a lot of neuro bullshit circulating. And the second part of the book is more about, okay, how do we use this knowledge in cognitive science to improve games. So I talk more about what UX is about, where it's coming from, and what are the principles and the framework that we can use, so we can have some good methodology to do that iterative cycle that I was talking about earlier, so that we can improve the games.
Do you find game developers actively seek out your book, or at least search for something like that to help them better develop their UX?
Yeah, UX is getting trendy, so I do have some people that are interested, of course, and others are less interested, and that's fine. But yeah, it's I think, like we were saying earlier, it's becoming even more difficult to make games, and the competition is super high, and the demands are quite high as well. So it makes that methodology even more so interesting, because even though experienced game designers and game creators overall have a good understanding of how to make good games, it's a whole team that had to work on the game, and sometimes it's hard to convey why things are going to work better than others to someone that's more junior, and that methodology is also helping to put names on things and to have a background of why these elements are working better than others. So all of that makes it a very good tool to work with and to work with a team.
Yeah, definitely. And I know it's going to come up in the chat, but it's not audiobook, but you can get an e-book, right?
Yeah, so that's I'm really super annoyed about that, but as I found out, that is actually quite rare to have very niche book like professional books like that turn into ebooks. But yes, you have it on Kindle, on audiobook, sorry. So you have it on Kindle and ebook. So I can still get a transcript, but it's not. I mean, it's not. I know that the experience is not as good as a real audiobook, and I'm really sorry about that, because there's not much I can do, sadly, about it. Maybe one day I can try to see if I can read it myself with my French accent.
There you go.
And have it on YouTube or something. I don't know. But it's something that I need to talk about with my publisher.
I know one of the first things that I look at when I'm going for audiobooks is it read by author? So that is a big thing. If it's read by the author, a lot of people, it catches people's eyes more.
Yeah, but acting is a real work, and it's a job. So I don't know if I would be good enough to read it properly. I would actually prefer an actor or an actress to read it, like a professional to do that.
Nice. So let's see. Okay, Danny says it's already an ebook. I already got it. Okay, so your second book, The Psychology Gamer. Oh shoot.
The Psychology of Video Games.
Yes, Psychology of Video Games.
It's much more for a broad audience, and it's a very short book. It's 100 pages, and it's to explain a little bit what's the psychology of making games. So what do we use? The stuff that we talked about, the cognitive science and UX approach. And the second part is about the psychology of playing games. So what is the impact of certain video games on players? So most of the time the impact is neutral, but in certain cases you can have negative impacts of video games, and in other cases you can have positive impacts of video games. And so the idea is to synthesize all the research that we have so far about the impact of certain video games on the positive and negative impacts, and it's ending with a little chapter on ethics. And this book is not out yet. It's going to be out in October.
Okay. Very good. Do you think that game developers, like, okay, for example, now there's going to be two different aspects to this. One, you got the indie developer, and the one you got your AAA developers. So you got a team versus maybe 1 or 3 people, for example.
Yeah.
So let's just take the big time, the AAA for now, because it's a team aspect. Do you think that they take into consideration the psychology behind developing a game more so than less so than the indie developers?
No, I would say. I mean, it's more on game developers' curiosity, or have they met a lot of people talking about UX? I think at AAA, it's more often the case that the studio has a playtest lab, for example, or have UX designers. So they have more resources to be able to do that. Whereas the indie developers, they might be interested in it, but they don't have a lot of resources to do that. That's also the reason why I wanted to publish the first book, the Gamer's Brain, to make available to more people all these resources. So it's just a book. So of course it's not as good as having a playtest lab or having UX designers, but at least it can help a bunch of people to understand the concepts behind and being able to anticipate problems from happening. It's much harder for indie developers because it's just hard to develop a game with this reduced number of people and much less budget and resources. It's really tough.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking from an indie point of view because, when I'm doing writing, for example, like I've got a clear idea of my story, boom, get it out. Hey, if you like it, you like it. If not, read something else. So from an indie developer, I kind of imagine it the same way. Like, I got a great idea for a video game. Here it is. If you like it, play it. If not, move along.
Yeah, so and that part I totally understand, but UX is not about changing your intentions as an artist or a designer creating a game, because a video game is unlike a book or a movie, doesn't advance without players' input. And so because you need players' input to really have the experience of the game, you do need to have consideration of how humans interact with machines. And so the idea is not to change, if you want a game that is super difficult or is a super conceptual and this is part of the challenge of the game, that's fine. But you still want to make sure you don't add frictions or you don't add challenges in your game to understand your game or to experience your game that you did not intend.
Yeah.
And that's really something that a lot of people misunderstand about UX. It's not about making the game easier. It's not about changing the intentions of the game. It's to remove the frictions that are not by design so that your players can experience the game the way you intended. And the fact that they like it or not, that's a whole different story. Right. And yes, you can make a game that is going to be hard, Dark Souls, it's intended to have a very intense experience and to be very hard for players. That's totally fine because this is the intent behind the game. But now if you have a game that is about challenging attention, but now players don't understand because they can't perceive correctly what I have to do in the game, then you have additional frictions, or because they struggle with the menus or understand how to they need, or they don't remember that they have an ability, they don't understand how the skill tree works. It's not part of the challenge intended by the game.
Yeah, I was thinking to kind of give me a better idea to think about it in this sense is that you've got movies and you got video games, right? You got movies, but then you've got horror. And you've got romance, and you've got blah 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 blah. Same with video games. So it's a different. It's not saying like, hey, we're going to rewrite movies. No. We're just going to readjust it to make it a better experience for the horror fans or the romance fans. Yeah,
absolutely. And if it's a horror movie, you don't want it to be funny.
Right.
So you have horror movies that are intended to be funny, but let's say you really want to have a horror movie and it doesn't intend to be funny. Well, so we have techniques to do that. It's going to be dark and the field of view of the camera is going to be narrower. So these are all elements that we ensure that the players are going to experience. And so if they don't experience that, we correct a movie for that. But on top of that, with video games, we need to take into account the input of the player to have the experience of the game. In the movie, it's not the case. So we don't have that extra layer of complexity.
Yeah. Danny Maria, you see, is in the chat, and she too is a psychology major, I believe. She's got some degrees in psychology and also is a gamer. And she says she's definitely going to be looking forward to your new book.
Sweet, thank you.
Pretty awesome. Me too, actually. Although I despise listening to books on my screen reader because it's so monotonous.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's not.
But since that book is smaller, maybe I can actually have a session where I can read it because it's 100 pages. Like my first book, it's much longer, so it's more complicated to do. But I'll see with the publisher Routledge if we can do something like that, and I don't know, have it in audio somehow. I'll check it out if we can do that. But I totally understand your frustration. It's really not intended to be that way, and I wish we had more accessibility in books, and it's really bad. I hope that things are going to change in that regard.
Yeah, it would be kind of nice where you can just send your book to a repository or something, and then somebody reads it for you.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
Oh, definitely.
That would be awesome.
I'm all for that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Celia, I'm checking the chat right now to see if there's any questions for you, but I want to thank you very much for coming on and giving me some of your time. I know you're a busy lady, so it's much appreciated.
My pleasure. Yeah, I always love to talk about my stuff. It's actually hard to make me stop, but I thank you so much for having me on your show and talking about all these things. So I had new questions, which is great.
Nice.
So that was a cool conversation.
Right on. Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. Maybe we can have you back on once your book comes out, or maybe before it, so we can help push it. That'd be kind of cool.
With pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Celia, very much. There are no questions right now, but if you guys want, you can follow her on Twitter. You want to give that out?
Sure. It's at Celia Hodent, Hodent.
Great. And the link is in the description box below, as well as Celia's website and links to her books and all that great stuff. So cool. Thank you again very much, Celia.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Alrighty, everybody. That was Celia Hodent. Excellent conversation, I think. Of course, it's video games, so I'm really down with that. Thank you guys all for being here. In Darkness, Danny Marie, AUC. There was a new person in here. Let me get to that person and say hi. Blind Toes is here. Welcome. Who else? I thought I saw somebody else. Ability Mom. Hey, welcome, Ability Mama. How you doing? Yes, it was very interesting. There was a new person. I want to find it and say hi. Blind Toes. Ability Mom. Blind Toes. I know it started with a D. I will find you. Oh, here we go. Dolls. DAHLS. Go Celia. Go Celia. Go Celia. Thank you for coming in and watching. Much appreciated. Let's see what else we got. Show latest. Good interview. Well, thank you, Blind Toes. It was fun. It was a blast. Yeah, she is super awesome. And Blind Toes, there you go. There's your French Canadian accent. And I now completely agree with you. I'll definitely read. Got that one. Darkness. Overload. Nice. Well, I'm going to take off, you guys, because I have a phone call of a possible job opportunity. So I'm looking forward to that. Again, everybody, thank you very much for coming in. Please hit that like, share, subscribe button if you haven't done so. Also, what was that in Darkness? Whoops, words. Thank you for speaking today, Celia. Wow. Awesome. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. Celia in Darkness is from Canada too. I got a lot of great fans in Canada. So, anyway. Oh, I don't need this open. What was I saying? Oh yeah, hit the like button, pretty please. Hit the share button, pretty please. If you haven't done so, please hit that subscribe button. That would be awesome. Oh, that's what I was saying. Yes. Let's see. Thank you to Nicole for being a new member of the channel. Much appreciated. And of course, along with Earth Magic 7 and Agent #Z%. I almost got that wrong. The members of the channel, much appreciated. If you guys do want to become a member as well, you can join by clicking the join link in the description box. It's right after all of Celia's bio stuff. So, with that being said, this has been Theory of Blind Man. Don't forget, love is blind. Keep it blind.